The sun had barely risen, and the village was silent, just like every other morning, providing a gentle golden glow across the plain houses and gravel roads. Garrett be already hard at work, the blacksmith's hammer produced steady, rhythmic beats. He wasn't just ordinary blacksmith, his hands had the knowledge that was passed down through the generations as he skillfully shaped metal. Years of artistry, fine-tuning each tool and blade with accuracy. As he fashioned yet another tool for the peasants, Garrett labored silently, the heat from the forge warming his face. Despite his callous hands, he was skilled at this modest existence and enjoyed it. Solid, his muscles moved with purpose, drawn not simply from brute force but also from the kind of experience that comes only from years of training. Of honing a skill, he was precisely aware of how much force to use to each blow. Even though no one else realized how much talent it took, he took pride in his work and knew just when to remove the metal from the fire. Although peace had lasted here for as long as it had, the hamlet depended on him for tools, horseshoes, and even the occasional weapon. As far as anyone could recall, the peace began as and finished on a day that nobody in the hamlet could have predicted. Far off, there was a peculiar rumble in the air. Garrett paused in the middle of the stroke, puzzled as he peered up. It was too early for a storm to be approaching the sky, and the sound wasn't thunder. It was even more strange when he stepped outside his store and used to wipe his brow, the back of his palm, and glanced up to see something enormous and metallic, a ship breaking through the clouds. Hovering in the sky, it was unlike anything Garrett had ever seen before. Throwing of people started to assemble in the streets as the shadow above the village lowered, their expressions displaying a mixture of terror and wonder. Nobody had ever witnessed anything like this. The ground shook as the ship landed just past the village with a loud thump. Beneath it, tall individuals emerged from the spacecraft. They weren't particularly human. Clearly, they were at least 7 feet tall, and their armor shone in the sunshine. Bees were soldiers, but unlike any other, their faces were concealed by sleek helmets. From the stories passed down throughout the years, Garrett had never seen precision move with such clarity. They were well-trained and exuded a sense of superiority, as if they thought this location was beneath them. The troops approached one of the villagers, who backed away uneasily as the leader moved forward. He asked in a contemptuous manner, "Is this what they call Earth?" His voice, Garrett, was pathetically cold and metallic as he stood on the edge of the audience, taking in these warriors were silent, as evidenced by their stance and gait. Weren't here to assist, rather, they were here to either take resources or perform tasks. As they scanned the village like predators sizing up their prey, he could feel a pit growing in his gut. The soldier's leader cast a quick glance around him before settling on Garrett's business. He then strode over with a sorrowful heart. With self-assured strides, he came to a stop in front of the blacksmith's forge, his eyes resting on the implements and arms. "A blacksmith hanging on the walls. How charming," he remarked, his voice brimming with how archaic is it that you still beat metal with fire and hammers. Garrett remained silent, showing no emotion on his face. Particularly not with individuals like these. He was aware of when he was being made fun of, but he also knew better than to take offense. The guy laughed and turned to face his fellow soldiers. "Can you believe this?" the leader asked, pointing to the forge. "It's no wonder they still use Stone Age methods." Planet Rip is responsible for making the other people laugh with him, their voices resonating through their helmets. Garrett was merely a reminder of a vanished era and a representation of a society that had never progressed. They failed to notice the years of commitment he had put into his work, the workmanship or his sense of pride in it. Was little, inconsequential, and helpless. Yet Garrett wasn't alarmed by what he had seen. Even though it may not have been on such a large scale, he could sense that these men, with all their modern technology, had never experienced real hardship or required labor. Everything they possessed came naturally to them, which made them dangerous, showed no regard for whatever they couldn't conquer right away. The leader scoffed once more, obviously tired of the "enjoy the limited time you have left here, human," the blacksmith replied in silence. His contemptuous tone won't last long once we begin obtaining what we require. The people were silent as the troops turned and started to leave, leaving Garrett standing by his forge. Whispers of fear spread as they slowly froze in shock at the encounter. Dispersed across the throng, wondering what they might do to stop creatures of this nature given their lack of army and weaponry. Peasants and a blacksmith who forged plows and horseshoes, but Garrett didn't immediately return to his job. Instead, he stood. Something was fermenting inside for a while as they watched the soldiers vanish back toward their ship. He wasn't a fighter. But there had been a silent storm brewing inside of him ever since those soldiers entered his hamlet. He was skilled with metal and could make items other than the soldiers' tools. People laughed after seeing his shop and forge, not realizing the full extent of his abilities. They wouldn't have seen the weapons he could create or the way he could bend metal to suit his needs, but they would have the locals withdrew to their houses, and Garrett turned to return to his store. The forge was still glowing bright, and the equipment was ready, but he had no idea what to do at the moment. The sound of his hammer clanging indicated that he would not allow these soldiers to destroy his house without putting up a fight. Once more, steadier and louder, determining the days that followed, where the military had established a base just outside the settlement, and the residents were full with unease. Do more than observe as enormous vehicles started to roar across the terrain. Destroying the locals felt helpless because they had little control over the earth while they harvested resources, weapons, defenses, and just their dwellings in the land they had inhabited for. Although the forge felt different now that generations had passed, Garrett had carried on working in silence. The steady cadence of his hammer wasn't as helpful as he previously was. He could feel the invaders' weight bearing down on him. Not only were they stealing resources, but they were also making everyone feel helpless with every move they made. The soldiers didn't seem to mind when the hammer became stronger and more violent, as though he was trying to pound his annoyance into the metal. Too preoccupied with their machinery to spend much time with the villagers, they were taking what they needed out of the ground. Advanced technological weaponry capable of instantly destroying the entire village. If they so desired, humans weren't. Garrett observed them intently every time, not so much as a threat as a bother to be overlooked. Every time he came close to their base, he watched their movements, their armaments, and their haughtiness. Spoke down to anyone who ventured to approach them. He observed how they treated the people as though the land was all that was. One day, a troop of soldiers returned to the village, bored, and took their leave. While in search of amusement, they strolled through the streets making fun of the locals and highlighting how archaic they were. The villagers avoided conflict out of fear of upsetting them, but Garrett was aware that they were bullies and that they wouldn't be content to be made fun of. Bullies always want more. Before they knew it, the previous leader, the one who had made fun of Garrett's shop, was back in front of it. Once more, Forge approached Garrett with a smug smile on his face. Anvil, still playing, eyed the newly forged sword that Garrett had just finished. "You know we could demonstrate with your sticks," Blacksmith, the leader, snarled as he tapped the blade with his armored finger. Garrett remained silent. "You have actual weapons, but you wouldn't understand them because they are too sophisticated for your small brain." Keeping his sword sharp in front of him, he didn't have to answer. Discovered a long time ago that guys like these would not stop talking if you didn't listen to them because they were already convinced of their own superiority, but the commander desired more than just silence. He was more interested in seeing Garrett crack to demonstrate that even the meek blacksmith in the village could be intimidated by their moving in closer. Presence tell you what he said. "Why don't we make this?" Garrett looked at her. "Interesting. You think your craftsmanship is so special, don't you?" As the leader looked into the soldier's eyes for the first time, he saw calm, steady stare rather than panic. Enjoy it, but Garrett wasn't giving him the terror, or at least the obedience he was looking for. He stepped back and drew a sword. "Either way, let's see how that sword of yours holds up against something real." Weapon from his side, it was distinctly something beyond anything Earth has ever seen, sleek and gleaming with electricity. Clearly anticipating Garrett, he grinned and said, "Duel me with this, you with your ancient toys." The locals were uneasy as the crowd surrounding them began to back down. Talking to each other, anxious about what would occur, Garrett gently got to his feet while gripping his blade. After completing the forging, he turned it over in his palms to examine the edge, and then met the soldier's gaze once more. Garrett remarked calmly, and the guy was shocked that he hadn't clearly confident that Garrett would accept the challenge with ease. He grinned. "This would be a simple victory," he continued, taking a step back and lifting his weapon to see what your tiny hammer could do. May perform. The duel was brief, the soldier's haughty and conceited swinging his weapon with reckless ease. He was quick but inaccurate, assuming his modern technology would accomplish the task for him. And his weapon would be able to penetrate anything Garrett had created. Yet Garrett's sword wasn't just any old blade. It was expertly forged, using with accuracy and methods the extraterrestrials had never witnessed. The soldier's weapon, when it collided with the blade, a loud, piercing crack produced sparks that soared, but not from the energy weapon. Garrett's sword had struck true, but the blacksmith's blade remained firm, the edge shining in the for a few while. The soldier hesitated in the sunlight, staring confusedly at his weapon that he had anticipated breaking. Garrett appeared to falter with just one blow from his sword rather than his own weapons. Didn't give him a chance to recover, swinging his blade in a swift, smooth move. Once more, this time aiming for the soldier's arm. The soldier's armor, which was thought to be unbreakable, advanced and buckled beneath the soldier staggered back in astonishment as a result of the power of the sword biting into the metal. Vanished in a moment. To be replaced with unanticipated fear and bewilderment, Garrett didn't need to pursue the attack because none of them had after the point was made. The villagers watched in disbelieving silence as the extraterrestrial, the leader's face, was pallid beneath his helmet as the soldier gripped his broken armor. Gazed at Garrett with a newfound respect or even terror in his eyes in response, the soldier turned and departed, with his companions trailing closely after. They did not make fun of the locals as this time. They departed without saying anything. Their previous haughtiness had vanished, leaving a silent Garrett stood in awkward quiet as he watched them leave, his hand still firmly holding onto his familiar sword hilt. The soldiers would return, so this wasn't done, and they wouldn't give up lightly. However, for the time being, the village was secure, and Garrett had demonstrated to them something crucial: the troops' advanced weapons, armor, and technology that were unmatched on Earth. Yet Garrett had something years of perfecting his skill, and knowing the characteristics of metal, realizing the harmony between power and accuracy. They had misjudged him, and they had paid for it as the village's sun began to set. Garrett went back to his forge, put the sword back on the endle, ready to begin, but there was still work to be done. His hands were steady. Sharpen the edge again. As soon as Garrett's battle was announced, word swiftly the town was ablaze with tales of the blacksmith's victory over the extraterrestrial soldier. Hoping that when everyone else had given up and were still terrified, there would be a possibility for them to resist Garrett, knowing that the soldiers wouldn't take the humiliation lightly, remain silent, return, and if they did, it wouldn't be merely for display. It didn't take long for the following day. Additional aliens showed up, and they marched into the village with their leader. The soldier Garrett had previously fought was with them at the front. His gaze fixed on Garrett's shop through his armor had restored his pride. Yet there remained a tension in the entire town, seemed to be holding its breath due to something chilly and harsh in the air. The leader paused before Garrett's forge once again, his expression harsh and his eyes narrowed. He said in a quiet voice, "Narrowed, you got lucky, but we don't believe in luck. Trust in our power skills, and we'll show you that they pale in comparison." Garrett was standing by the forge opposite us, his arms folded, observing the warriors with a serene look, knowing that this would present another hurdle. This time there was no smile on the leader's face as he expressed his desire to see how good Garrett was. Sarcastic tone. But this was real. The duel had damaged their self-esteem. The leader continued, "A true duel between you and me, but they wanted to restore it. We'll settle this once and for all. Gimmicks, no luck. Just your sword versus my weapon, and your people after I win will realize they can't resist us." Garrett didn't answer right away, but he glanced at the villagers who were standing close to the soldiers, watching with worried expressions. They were now counting on him. The atmosphere was charged with expectancy, even though they chose not to express it directly. He was unable to back down, and I now accept Garrett's statement that his voice was steady. Leader nodded, content that there was no more time to squander and that he wanted the combat to occur right then and there in Village Square. The troops created a circle to make room for the two. Locals watched the fights from a distance, not knowing what was going to happen because they had already witnessed Garrett triumph. However, things felt different now that the stakes were higher in Garrett. The leader had adopted a haughty grunt. The leader, with his sword in hand, circled and advanced, unshed. A piece of extraterrestrial technology that flickered blue, elegant and menacing, in stark contrast to Garrett's basic crafted blade. But Garrett was aware that he should never underestimate his opponent, because he had long since learned that the person using the weapon the leader attacked possessed the real power of the weapon, not its technology. Initially, his weapon moved so quickly that the majority of the villagers were caught off guard, hummed as it precisely cut through the air, straight for Garrett, but Garrett wasn't taken by surprise. He blocked the blow with his sword, causing the sound of metal hitting metal to reverberate across the plaza. The ferocity of the blows gave him a shock up his arm, but he persisted since the leader didn't back down. Garrett struck quickly and relentlessly, and his actions were well planned and precise. He wasn't merely knew how to battle by depending on the force of his weapon, but Garrett wasn't simply a blacksmith, had been in enough fights over the years to know how to control himself. He used his sword to deflect every blow. Calm, methodical, and never wasting energy, it became evident during the duel that this struggle was not going to be over quickly. The commander was competent, but Garrett was patient and knew when to hold off. The ideal time to allow his opponent to tire themselves. The leader's blows were becoming more forceful and more frustrated. Garrett's alien haughtiness had given way to something else as he kept evading them. Doubt. Then the time Garrett noticed that the leader had swung wide in an attempt to deliver a powerful blow. Approaching, allowing the alien's weapon to pass by unharmed as he sidestepped, and Garrett overextended himself and hit his sword hard in that split second. And quickly, aiming the hidden blade toward his armor rather than the leader's weapon. The leader staggered as Mark let off a loud crack that sliced through the alien's armor, which was thought to be invincible. He gazed down at the wound in his side, his expression a mixture of amazement and pain. The audience gasped, but Garrett remained still as blood seeped through the armor's break and stained the ground under him. Press the attack, he just stood there, waiting for the commander with his sword in hand. Feeling hurt and unsteady, he knew he had been defeated. His face darkened with rage as he glanced at Garrett, but his eyes were no longer full of sarcasm or conceit. Instead, it was a somber reality. That you, the commander, had begun, but this human, this blacksmith, had surpassed him. Didn't finish because he knew the men had seen their commander hurt. Hurried to assist him, removing him from the circle. As a result, Garrett's expression changed. No mockery, no contempt, only reverence, or maybe dread, as the peasants looked on, startled quiet as the soldiers withdrew. Their commander holding onto his side as they vanished back toward Garrett. The commander of their base was by himself in the square with his sword shining in the last of the day's light. This was not the end. The soldiers would return and would not give up until they achieved their goal. Don't forget that on this day, God demonstrated that the inhabitants of Earth have something that made them strong and resilient. He glanced to the villagers, who had a mixture of shock and disbelief on their faces. The aliens didn't comprehend his tenacity, had witnessed him defeat the most sophisticated equipment they had ever seen using just a blade. Crafted at a modest blacksmith shop, Garrett didn't have to elaborate. Realized that although the battle had not ended, they were still not as helpless as they had believed. Garrett had strolled back to with his blade still in possession. His forge had learned something from the duel as well. Despite their advanced technology, the aliens were unable to gauge the actual power of the people they were attempting to subjugate. They were unaware that, in the hands of an experienced user, even the most basic instruments made. Garrett understood what he had to do as he retreated into his shop be far more powerful than the most sophisticated weapon. The forge would shine brightly tonight since there was still work to be done, and the aliens would discover how the following time. The day following the duel, there was a shift in the villagers' behavior, indicating that they had greatly underestimated him. With fresh optimism, yet they remained cautious and had no idea what lay ahead. Garrett had accomplished something nobody believed was possible, yet everyone was burdened by the situation's reality. The soldiers had pulled back, but this wasn't finished by a long shot. The soldiers outside the village soon heard of Garrett's victory, and soon after that, more when some of them arrived, their behavior had drastically changed. They no longer walked with the haughtiness they once did. Their footsteps carried a fresh exhaustion, as if they had now grasped that this world and its inhabitants might not be as just as they had thought. A troop of soldiers led by, unlike the others, this new commander was, in his opinion, older and more experienced. Therefore, he didn't come to instead of making fun of or challenging Garrett. He approached him with a level of respect that was absent from the first encounter. The duel had made them reconsider their strategy. Garrett was no longer just a blacksmith. He had evolved into something greater, possibly a representation of human potential. The new commander didn't waste time on small talk. He was blunt and said, "We underestimated you." Acknowledged that his voice was calm and that it was an error that we will not repeat. Garrett listened intently with his arms crossed, knowing that what was about to happen wasn't only an admission of defeat. It served as a warning that we have examined your tactics and weaponry. The commander went on, "We've seen how you fight and how you use the limited resources you have, but you never make mistakes. Even though you are a talented craftsman, what you did won't be sufficient the next time because we have more than you can ever conceive. In one way or another, the world's resources will belong to us." Garrett didn't flinch. The commander was being honest, but he also understood that fear would not advance him because he had already encountered technology and emerged victorious. Even though the men didn't really comprehend why the commander took a "you don't have to die," Steep Closer said. Lowering his voice so Garrett was the only one who heard. He continued, "With the rest of them, your skills could be useful to us. Join us and leave this place behind. Someone with your talent has no need to squander it here protecting the lost." Because Garrett gave him a straight stare, he didn't need time to reflect. The instant the military arrived, he made it obvious in his response, "This is my home." With a stern expression, the commander said, "I'm not going anywhere." Anticipated as much, but Garrett's rejection left the commander feeling unsatisfied and just a sense of inevitable straightened, nodding once more, "And then you'll fall with the others." He turned on his heel, murmured, and left with the men trailing closely after. The peasants appeared apprehensive as they observed the exchange from a distance. They understood that the troops would return, and that they wouldn't come to discuss the next time since the commander's remarks had meaning. Something had changed. Garrett was no longer a warrior in the open, and his calm defiance had given them something to cling to. Conventional sense, but he had demonstrated to them that resistance was about more than just power and weaponry. Pride, skill, and determination were occasionally sufficient to cause even the most formidable adversaries to pause. After the soldiers left, Garrett went back to his forge, mentally preparing for what would happen next. The commander's offer hadn't come as a surprise because they respected his abilities and strength. Were a kind of power, but they were still unaware of the extent of the challenges they faced. It wasn't only the relationship between people and the earth they lived on, not about metal or weaponry. Safe within the forge, Garrett resumed his work, his hands moving in tandem with he wasn't just getting ready for the next battle, he was getting ready for something bigger with every methodical blow of the hammer. An additional thing, the soldiers had given him the time he required, and he wasn't going to squander it on his trade. The soldiers were busy getting ready in the alien camp, but what would really matter was that they had mocked. The commander gave the order to bring in new weaponry with more sophisticated technology than what they had previously utilized. They had no fear of the people because they were prepared to end any opposition permanently. They were afraid that Garrett would throw off their carefully thought-out conquest, but even there were rumors of doubt among the soldiers because the duel had damaged their self-esteem. Although they didn't publicly talk about it, the victory of the blacksmith had sowed a doubt. How could the thought of a man wielding a mere blade surpassing their leader persisted in their thoughts? Could not dismiss Garrett without a fight, knowing that the soldiers wouldn't hold back the next time. Come with everything they owned and that they would have to battle to survive, but he also understood that he wouldn't be helped by fear. Having met them once and survived, it was now his turn to demonstrate to them that humanity wasn't something to take lightly, with the village Garrett's shadows growing longer as the sun sank. The hammering sound of forge radiated brilliantly into the darkness, frightening the peasants even as they heard it. The soldiers found solace in the music, believing it to be a reminder that they weren't alone and that someone was fighting for them. They had the technology and the numbers to take everything they desired, but they were unaware that people had something more. Something that was indescribable and measurable. The determination to persevere in the face of overwhelming against them was the wisdom inherited from previous generations, the abilities refined from diligent effort and resolve. And the blacksmith Garrett, whom they had formerly ridiculed, embodied that spirit. He was more than simply a craftsman. He served as a reminder of what it meant to battle for one's soul, as well as one's survival. Of a people, Garrett was prepared for what would be the hardest war yet. With each blow of his hammer, his forge would continue to fire, crafting not only weapons but also the future. Military would return to his hamlet, and when they did, they would have to deal with the full weight of a people who refused to. The commander's words rang in his head, ready to be overcome. But Garrett understood the fact. As long as he still had the strength, this wasn't a lost cause just yet. To wield his sword and hammer, it would not be the peaceful but anxious days after the commander's visit. The locals were aware that the military would return, and that there would be no opportunities for surrender or discussion. The mood had altered, and individuals were moving purposefully. Although their expressions revealed the terror that weighed heavily on their hearts, yet something fresh, hadn't hoped that they could have a chance, because they have been there previously. The center of that hope was Garrett's forge, where he labored late into the night. His hammer rhythm solid and steady. Soothing to those who saw him, the people came to regard him as more than simply a blacksmith. Having defeated the extraterrestrial army, had become a symbol of their tenacity. And people came to him seeking assistance with their equipment and weaponry, or just to observe him work for a short while. Garrett didn't allow their appreciation divert him from what he knew, even though they found solace in his composed resolve. Realized that the upcoming conflict would involve more than just a fight. The troops would come in force and use all of their technical might. He was fully aware of what was going to happen. The village had only primitive weapons, they lacked an army and sophisticated weaponry. The knowledge of the country they had lived on for generations, the power of a single blacksmith who Garrett sat by his forge alone the night before the attack, refusing to give up. Upon examining the sword he had made for the impending conflict, it was evident that he had spent weeks honing it, ensuring that every edge was precise and every component was perfectly balanced. It wasn't made utilizing the most cutting-edge materials or technology, yet it was constructed with something that warriors could never duplicate. Years of expertise, understanding, and a link to the planet Earth. Garrett had invested all of his resources on this sword, making it more than just a tool. Rather, it was a symbol of all he stood for. For as dawn broke, the sound of approaching footfall reverberated throughout the community, signaling the arrival of the soldiers. This wasn't the motley crew as they marched with icy precision, weapons at the ready, and determined expressions on their faces. Group from before, when these warriors were equipped for battle, and the same leader, the commander who had paid Garrett a visit, waited in front, staring into the blacksmith's shop as Garrett left. Taking his forged sword, he confronted the terrified townsfolk. Although the people surrounding him weren't warriors, they had decided to support Garrett no matter what, had witnessed his potential, and had faith in him despite what looked to be against them. Unfeasible, the commander lifted his hand to order his men to halt. He said this during a brief period of stillness and a thick silence that enveloped the community. "This is your final chance," the commander continued, his voice soulless and icy. "No one else will stand down." Garrett didn't move, but he must die. "We'll take what we came for, and you can live." Realized that this was a fictitious offer because the army would seize their resources and all of their land as soon as they cashed in. Their freedom surrender was no longer an option, and without saying anything, he lifted the commander's eyes narrowed as he issued the command, the sword's polished surface glinting in the morning light. Soldiers charged forward, and what followed was a combat unlike anything the village had ever seen. Armor that shone with cutting-edge technology and weapons that buzzed with electricity. Yet Garrett and the villagers fought. Garrett led the charge as they returned with everything they owned, using the countryside and their knowledge of every hill and tree. Blade blazing as he advanced through the rows of fighters, dispatching each one with unparalleled skill, and the blade in his palm appeared to be nearly alive, reacting to each soldier's action and thought. For all of their modern technology, found it difficult to keep up with the resistance. They hadn't anticipated it coming from a tiny community. On Garrett's blade, forgotten on planet Garrett, slices through their armor with precise attacks. Deadly, he fought not only for himself but also for everyone. When the war raged on, it became evident that the land that had reared him for the people who depended on him. Garrett fought like a man, even though the soldiers' numbers were decreasing and their confidence had been destroyed. With every action calculated, every blow intended to disable or disarm the leader, who watched in shock when his forces withdrew and were unable to breach the villagers' defenses. After witnessing enough, the commander himself advanced with a weapon in hand. Unable to comprehend how using only a basic sword, the blacksmith has repelled his elite forces, but he would now complete it on his own. Garrett and the commander confronted. The combat surrounding them was fading into the distance as the commander moved first, his weapon shining fiercely. Energy. But Garrett was prepared because he had already witnessed this and knew how to respond. The sound of metal hitting metal reverberated around the battlefield as their weapons clashed. The duel was intense, yet it was evident right away that Garrett was in the lead. The commander battled expertly, but he lacked. The Garrett, however, battled with a connection to his weapon and an awareness of the terrain surrounding him. The weight of many centuries behind him, each blow, each motion was exact. Yet in the end, the commander fell to his as Garrett's blade reached its mark. Knees defeated the surviving men, who watched as their captain fell and withdrew. Had lost. The village was once again calm. The conflict was ended, but the price had. Although the villagers had lost family members and friends, they had gained something far more valuable: Garrett's freedom. Held his sword in the middle of the square, having battled for the rights as well as his village, to carry on as they always did without worrying that the people might be supplanted by something more powerful or larger around him, their expressions full of appreciation, adoration, and a fresh-found sense of pride. Garrett had demonstrated to them that skill, not simply might or technology, was what made a person strong. As the light started to fade, creating long shadows across, about never giving up on the things that counted most, Garrett went back to his forge in the hamlet, finished his work for the time being, and carefully placed the sword on the anvil. Even once the battle was finished, there would always be more to defend and more to fight for. Thus the forge would never stop burning. Garrett was aware that the soldiers would come at some point, and he would be prepared, but for the time being, the village was secure, and that sufficed. The blacksmith who had before been written off had turned into a legend both in his own right and as a legacy of a straightforward craftsman who opposed an empire would endure for many decades.